Chapter 1. Be quiet, children, said Mrs. Marble. Can you see that father's busy? So he was. He propped his aching forehead on his hand and tugged at his reddish mustache in an unhappy attempt at concentration. It was difficult to keep thinking about these wretched figures all the time, and it would have been even if Winnie did not try to poke John with a ruler in the intervals of squirming and muttering over her geometry homework. Mr. Marble worried at his mustache, while he peered at the column of figures on the scrap of paper before him. They seemed to be dancing in a faint mist under his eyes. He had been nerving himself for this effort for weeks now, and the instant that he began it he wanted to leave off. He was sure that looking at these figures would do no good. Nothing could do any good now. The column of figures was headed briefly debts. Rent was 3 weeks overdue, and that was the smallest item entered. He owed over £4 each to the butcher and the baker, and the milk bill came to over £5. How on earth had Annie managed to run up a £5 milk bill? He owed Evans, the grocer, more than £6. Mr. Marble felt that he hated Evans and had hated him ever since the time, a dozen years ago now, when they had arrived in Malcolm Road as a young couple and Evans, apron, basket, and whiskers complete, had called to solicit for their custom. Annie had just told him that Evans had threatened to put the brokers in if he were not paid. The bank would sack him for certain if anything like that happened. To Mr. Marble's strained eyes, the shape of Mr. Evans suddenly seemed to loom over the paper he was regarding, with a flash of teeth and a leer in his eye like the devil he was. Mr. Marble bit deep into the end of his pencil in a sudden flood of hatred. There were some other items in the column too. The names of some of the men at the bank appeared on the sheet of paper, and against them were set the amounts that Mr. Marble owed them. Some of these men had even smaller incomes than his, and yet they managed nevertheless to keep out of debt, and even were sometimes able to lend money to poor devils like himself. But of course they weren't married, or if they were they did not have extravagant wives like Annie. Not that Annie was extravagant, though. Not really. She was just careless. Rather like himself, thought Mr. Marble, with weary self-reproach, bending again to the figures. His debts amounted to no less than £30. On the asset side, he had put nothing. He knew the amount of his assets too well to bother to do that. He was acutely aware of it. The balance in his account at the bank was down to 5 shillings, and he had 2 florins in his pocket. There was no possibility of overdrawing. That would mean dismissal just the same. It was his fault, he supposed weakly. He had seen this coming as long ago as last summer, and he had decided then that if they did without a holiday and spent nothing at Christmas, they could get straight again. But they had had their holiday, and they had spent more than they should have done at Christmas. No, that had been Annie's fault. She had said that people would think it funny if they did not go to Worthing as she had told them they were going to do. And she had said it so often that in the end they had gone. And of course, she had really been the cause of all those figures that were set against the names of men in the bank on Mr. Marble's little list. A man had to have a drink occasionally, when he slipped out of the office at 11:30, and of course, he had to stand his friends one too, if they were with him. He could have paid for them easily if Annie had not spent all his money for him. And he had to smoke too, and have a good lunch occasionally. Mr. Marble resolutely refused to think of how much he had spent on his hobby of photography. He knew that it was more than he should have done, and somewhere inside his conscience there was a nasty feeling that there was another bill, unreckoned on his list, due to the chemist at the end of the road for things he had bought for this purpose. The shelves in the bathroom upstairs were full of materials, and Mr. Marble did not like to think of this, for he had never used half of them. Having lately found more amusement in contemplating his hobby and buying things for it than in actually doing anything. It was all very annoying and exasperating. How his head ached and how tired he felt. His mind was numb. The grim feeling of blank despair was swamped by complete lassitude of soul. He realized vaguely that his oft-repeated threat of sending the children to bed without any supper would soon be carried into effect despite himself. He would be sacked from the bank, and he would never get another job. He knew that well enough. He supposed it would end like the cases one read about in the paper, with his children's throats cut and himself and his wife dead of gas poisoning. But at present he hardly cared. He wanted to relax. When those blessed kids had been packed off to bed, he would drag the armchair up to the fire and put his feet up on the coal box and read the paper and be comfortable for a bit. In the decanter in the sideboard there was a little drop of whiskey left. Not much, of course. 3 drinks perhaps, or maybe 4. Mr. Marble hoped it was 4. With a drink and a paper and the fire, he could forget his troubles for a little, for he couldn't do anything towards remedying them this evening. Mr. Marble hardly realized that he had said the same thing to himself every evening for months now. The prospect seemed ineffably alluring. He yearned towards the decanter in the sideboard. And the wind was shrieking outside, sending the rain spattering against the windows. That would make it seem even more comfortable when he was beside the fire. But the children must be disposed of first. For some obscure reason, Mr. Marble had an objection to drinking whiskey in front of his children. His wife did not matter so much, although he would have preferred to have her out of the way too. A glance at the clock disappointed him a little. It was only 7:30, and the children would not be going to bed for another half-hour at the earliest. He felt suddenly irritable. He peered surreptitiously from under his eyebrows to see if he could catch them misbehaving so as to send them off at once. The whiskey would taste all the better if he could come to it fresh from a parental triumph and an autocratic exertion of authority. "Stop that noise, John," he ordered, with queer, feeble savageness. John looked round from his chair by the fire a little startled. 5 seconds ago he had been mazed in the pages of how England saved Europe and had been leading the Fusilier Brigade over heaps of dead up the blood-stained hill of Albura. He gazed vacantly at his father. "Don't look at me like a fool," spluttered Mr. Marble. "Do what you're told and stop that noise." The 2 orders were synonymous, but John did not realize that. "What did you tell me?" he asked vaguely. "No impertinence, now. I said stop that noise." "What noise, father?" asked John, more to gain time to collect his thoughts than for any other reason. But the question was fatal. "Don't try to deny it," said Mr. Marble. "Now, you were making a noise, you know, Johnny," said Mrs. Marble. "You were kicking with your feet," chimed in Winnie. "I didn't deny it," protested John. "You did," said Mrs. Marble. "You did," said Winnie. "Be quiet, Winnie," snapped Mr. Marble, rounding on his usual favorite in unusual fashion. "You're as bad as he is, and you know it. Have you done your homework yet? I send you to a good school, and this is all the return I get for it." "Why, I got a scholarship," replied Winnie, with a jerk of her head. "Are you being impertinent too?" demanded Mr. Marble. "I don't know what you children are coming to. It's time for bed when you start being rude to your parents." The fatal words were said, and the children looked at each other in dismay. Mrs. Marble made a typical faint-hearted effort on their behalf. "Oh, not just yet, father," she said. That was all the opposition that Mr. Marble needed to make him quite decided on the matter. "At once," he said. "John, go to bed and leave that book down here too. Winnie, pack up your things neatly ready for the morning and go along too. Let this be a lesson to you." "But I haven't done my homework," wailed Winnie, "and there'll be such a row if I haven't done it tomorrow." John did not answer. He was wondering how the Fusiliers would get on without him for the rest of their advance. Even Mrs. Marble was moved to further protest at this drastic action, but her half-hearted entreaties were ignored by both sides. "Be quick, I am waiting," said Mr. Marble. It was inevitable. Sullenly Winnie began to stack her books together. John stood up and put How England Saved Europe on the table. It was then, at the 11th hour, that diversion came. It came in the form of a loud knocking at the street door. For a second, everyone looked at each other startled, for visitors were a rarity in Malcolm Road, especially at the extraordinary hour of 7:30. Winnie recovered first. "I'll go," she said, and slipped through into the hall. The others heard her tugging at the latch, and then the gas suddenly flickered as a gust of wind came rushing in with the opening of the street door. A strange, loud, masculine voice made itself heard asking for Mr. Marble. He was about to go out too when Winnie reappeared. "Somebody for you, father," she said, and even as she spoke the owner of the strange voice came in behind her. He was tall and young, and seemed to be a study in browns, for he wore a brown trench coat and muffler, a brown tweed suit underneath, with brown shoes and socks. His face, too, was brown, although the shrieking wind outside had whipped it to a warm flush. He was young and debonair and handsome, and the sparkle of the raindrops on his muffler and the flash of his dark eyes and the gust of cold wind that entered the room at the same time as himself all combined to make his unexpected appearance as dramatic as even John, standing amazed by the fire, could wish for. The stranger paused for a moment at the doorway. "Good evening," he said, a little diffidently. "Good evening," replied Mr. Marble, wondering who on earth he was. "I suppose you're my Uncle William," said the new arrival. "I didn't expect you to know me." "I'm afraid I don't. My mother was Mrs. Medland, Mrs. Winnie Medland, your sister, sir, I think. I have just come from Melbourne." "Oh, of course. You're Winnie's boy? Come on in. No, let's get your coat off first. Annie, poke up the fire. Winnie, clear that stuff off that chair." Mr. Marble bustled out into the hall with his guest. His family heard him helping him off with his coat, and then, "And how's your mother now?" There was no immediate answer to this question. The trench coat and the hat had been hung up on the hall stand, and the pair were about to reappear in the dining room before the listeners there heard the hesitant, almost whispered reply. "She's dead. She died 6 months ago." Mr. Marble was still muttering the conventional condolences as they re-entered the dining room, but he changed to clumsy brightness at the earliest possible moment. Truth to tell, he was not particularly interested in his sister Winnie, of whom he probably had not thought for the 13.5 years that had elapsed since he had had his daughter christened after her. Also, he was feeling a little annoyed with this young man for turning up and interfering with the comfort of his evening. But Mr. Marble was not the man to show it. Hostility of any kind, even the instinctive hostility towards strangers, was a feeling to be carefully concealed on every occasion. That was the lesson learned as a result of a lifetime spent in carrying out the orders of other people. "Annie," said Mr. Marble, "this is our young nephew, Jim. Do you remember him when he was a little boy, just going out to Australia with Winnie and Tom?" "I think I can. You wore a sailor suit, didn't you, Jim? Here, Winnie John, this is a new cousin for you, one you never knew you had. Now sit down, man, and let's hear all your news. Take that chair, mister." "Jim, I mean," said Mrs. Marble, stumbling in embarrassed fashion at having to address an opulently clothed and handsome stranger by his Christian name, "you must be frozen." The new arrival was nearly as shy as was his hostess, but he suffered himself to be thrust gently into the best chair in the house, the one Mr. Marble had coveted all the evening, while Mrs. Marble ransacked her brain for something to talk about, and while the children drew as close as they could while remaining in the background. Mr. Marble plunged heavily into conversation. "When did you arrive?" he asked. "This morning only. I came on the Molina, arriving at Tilbury at 12. In fact, I only reached London and found a hotel and had something to eat before coming here." "But how did you know we lived here?" "Mother told me your address before she died." The stumble was excusable. After all, the boy was no more than 20. We'd often talked about this trip. She was coming with me, you see. She never liked Australia. I don't know why. And after father died, Tom dead as well? That's bad luck. Yes. He died the beginning of last year. It was that really that made mother. Quite, Mrs. Marble clucked in sympathetic chorus. She hated to hear of anyone dying. Mr. Marble made haste to change the conversation to matters more interesting. "And how is your father's business getting on?" he demanded. "Oh, pretty well. He made a lot of money during the war. He didn't want to, you know, but it just came," he said. "But mother sold out after he died. She said she couldn't run that big shipping office by herself, and I was too young, and they offered a good price for it, so she took it." "So you're a young man of leisure now, eh?" "I suppose so. I've only just come out of college, you know. Melbourne University. I'm having a look round to start with. That's what mother always planned for me." "Quite right too," said Mr. Marble, with the instinctive deference towards the independently rich which was by now an inevitable trait in his character. For a moment the conversation flagged, and the boy, still a little shy, had leisure to look about him. These were the only relatives he had on earth, and he would like to make the most of them, although, he confessed to himself, he was not greatly attracted at first sight. The room was frankly hideous. The flowered wallpaper was covered with photographs and with the worst kind of engravings. The spurious marble mantelpiece was littered with horrible vases. Of the two armchairs, one was covered with plush, the other with a chintz that blended unhappily with the wallpaper. The other chairs were plain bentwood ones. On a table in the window were dusty aspidistras in vast green china pots. In the armchair opposite him sat his uncle, in a shabby blue suit flagrantly spotted here and there. He was a small man, with sparse reddish hair and a bristling mustache of the same color. His weak gray eyes bore a worried expression, more worried even than the expression he had already noticed in the eyes of the tired men who had sat opposite him in the bus, which had brought him here. He had a silver watch chain across his rumpled waistcoat, and on his feet were shapeless carpet slippers, above which showed heather mixture socks sagging garterless round his ankles. Beside him, uncomplaining and uncomfortable on one of the bentwood chairs, sat his wife, frail, pale, and shabby. The most noticeable thing about her was her lopsided, steel-rimmed spectacles. The children were only visible to him when he turned his head uncomfortably. They certainly were more attractive. The little girl, Winnie, bore in her sharp features undeniable promise of good looks, as she sat with her hands in her lap beside the table, and the boy, John, wasn't he? Was quite a fair specimen of the 14-year-old. Nevertheless, young Medland did not feel at all at ease in his present situation. 6 weeks on board a first-class liner, the only male passenger unmarried between the ages of 15 and 50 is not the best introduction to the life of a poverty-stricken suburban home. Medland felt the sudden need to think about something else. "May I smoke?" he asked. "Why, yes, of course," said Mr. Marble, rousing himself suddenly to his hospitable duties. Mr. Marble plunged into his pocket in search of the battered yellow packet of cigarettes that lay there. It held 3 cigarettes he knew, and he had been treasuring them to smoke himself later in the evening. He spent as long as he could before producing them, and he was successful in his tactics. Medland already had produced his case and was offering it to him. It was a leather case, the parting gift of one of the middle-aged women on the boat. Women never realize that a leather case spoils cigarettes. But this was far more than a cigarette case. It was a substantial wallet, with pockets for stamps and visiting cards, and at the back, sagging open in consequence of the way in which Medland held it, was a compartment for money. And this was full. Marble noticed, as the case was tendered to him, a thick fold of treasury notes, £20 at least, maybe 30, decided Marble, gauging it with a bank clerk's eye. Beside it was another fold of banknotes, £5 notes, most probably. The sight positively dazzled poor Mr. Marble's vision. And it brought, too, a ray of hope into the grim cells of dumb despair in his soul. It was more than flesh and blood could bear not to remark on it. "That's a nice case," said Mr. Marble, tendering a lighted match to his guest. "Yes." Medland drew on his cigarette to make sure it was well lighted. "It was a present," he added modestly, and he held it out so that his uncle could see it more freely. The banknotes flashed once more before Marble's tortured eyes. "Well lined too," said Marble, striving to keep the envy out of his tone. "Yes, I got them at Port Said." "Oh, you mean the notes?" Medland did his best not to show surprise at his uncle's bad taste. To assist in this, he went into even further explanation. "I had to cash one of my letters of credit as soon as I got to London. The voyage left me without a bean, pretty nearly, and what I had was Australian money, of course." It was an idle enough speech, but it sufficed to set Mr. Marble thinking rapidly and unsteadily. This boy had arrived just in time to save him. He surely would not deny his new-found uncle a loan? Those treasury notes would save him, let alone the banknotes. And a loan from a nephew was not the same thing at all as a debt to that devil Evans, who would be putting the bailiffs in directly. It was not even in the same class as a debt to those men at the office, to repay whom only enough to keep them from complaining to higher officials had absorbed all his month's salary. On the heels of these thoughts came appalling realization of the peril of his position. It was the 3rd of the month only, and he had 10 shillings in the world with which to stave off his creditors and to support his family until his next payday. Before this, he had shut his eyes to the position with all the small resolution he possessed. But now that there was a chance of escape, the danger in which he stood was forced home upon him, making him shudder involuntarily a little and setting his heart thumping heavily in his chest. Mechanically, he glanced across at the sideboard in which was the decanter. But he checked himself. He was not going to have to waste one of his last 3, or was it 4, drinks on this boy. He thrust the thought of the whiskey fiercely on one side and turned to making cautious advances towards the nephew. "Did you have much difficulty in finding your way here?" he asked, the inevitable question always addressed to the newcomer to the suburbs. "Oh no," replied Medland. "I had your address, of course. Mother dug it up from your old letters before she died. So I knew it was Dulwich, and in Trafalgar Square I saw dozens of buses all going to Dulwich, and I got on one and came as far as the terminus. Then it was easy. The first person I asked told me the way to Malcolm Road." "Just so. And where did you say you were staying?" Medland had not said he was staying anywhere, but he told him. It was a substantial Strand hotel. It was then that Medland, apropos of this, made the remark that was to alter everything. "It's funny to think of," he said, striving to keep the conversation going, "but besides you there isn't a soul in England who knows anything about me. I don't think I was in the hotel more than an hour, and I only left my hand luggage there. The rest of my stuff is at Euston. What with going to the bank and so on, I simply didn't have time to collect it, even if it had got there. I was thinking to myself as I came here that if I got lost and never found my way back, no one would mind at all, except you, of course." Said Mr. Marble, and another train of thought came to him on the instant, and he shuddered again. Medland's shyness was turning to boyish talkativeness. He looked round to the 2 children. "Well," he said, and smiled, "you 2 don't seem to have much to say for yourselves." Winnie and John still remained silent. They had been keeping as quiet as mice so as not to draw attention to themselves and raise again the postponed question of bed. But beside this, John was lost in admiration of this weather-tanned man who had come all the way from Australia and who treated such an amazing trip through pirate-haunted seas with so little concern that he had said no word about it. And he spoke so casually about hotels too. John had noticed last year at Worthing that his father spoke of people who lived in hotels as opposed to those who lived in rooms, and even in boarding houses, with awe in his voice. And this man lived in a hotel and thought nothing of it. As for Winnie, she was thinking that he was the most beautiful man she had ever seen. His warm brown face and his brown tweeds with their intoxicating scent were wonderful. Then when he looked straight at you and smiled, as he had just done, he was handsomer than anyone she could imagine, far handsomer than the fairy prince in the pantomime at Christmas. "Speak up, children," said their father. To Medland's fastidious ear it sounded as if he might have added, "Tell the pretty gentleman his fortune." The children grinned shyly. Winnie could say nothing. But John made an effort, and used as he was to conversation owing to severe repression by his father during his queer moods of late. "You have kangaroos in Australia, haven't you?" he said, with a 14-year-old wriggle. "You're right," said Medland. "I've hunted them too." "Ooh," gasped John ecstatically. "On horseback?" "Yes, for miles and miles across the country, as fast as your horse could gallop." "I'll tell you all about it some day." Both children writhed in delight. "And bushrangers?" said John. Did you ever see Ned Kelly?" To Medland's credit, he did not laugh. "No such luck," he said. "There weren't many round where I lived. But I know a topping book about them." "Robbery Under Arms," said both children at once. "Oh, you've read it? Read it?" I should think they had. This was Mr. Marble's contribution to the conversation. "They're terrors for reading, those 2 kids are. Never see them without a book." "That's fine," said Medland. But the conversation wilted beyond recovery at this intrusion. And Marble, intent on getting Medland to himself, flashed a look at the children and jerked his head skywards. They understood, and climbed down dolefully from their chairs. "Bedtime, children," said Mr. Marble in a tone of surprise that was unsuccessful in its purpose of deceiving Medland, since he had caught the tail end of Marble's signal. "Good night, then." "Why, aren't you going to kiss me?" They had not been intending to do so. The custom had died out months before, when Marble had begun turning to the decanter in the sideboard for distraction from his troubles, and with children accustomed 3 months and used might as well never have existed. Besides, John was nearly too old for kissing now. Both John and Winnie kissed their father awkwardly, and their mother casually. Then John shook hands with his new cousin. It was the first time he had ever shaken hands as man to man, with eye meeting eye in man's fashion, and he was very proud of it. Winnie, too, tried to shake hands in imitation of her brother, but there was something in Medlin's smile and in the gentle traction he exerted on her hand that made her lean forward and kiss the boyish mouth tendered to her. It felt funny, different from other kisses she had known. It was a very silent pair that went up to bed. Marble turned away with evident relief as they closed the door. "Now we can be comfortable," he said. "Draw your chair up closer to the fire, Jim." "What a night," he added, as the wind howled outside. Medlin nodded moodily. He was feeling awkward. He was not at all at home with these strange people. He didn't like the way Marble behaved towards his children. The kids were all right, of course, and the mother was a nonentity. But there was an atmosphere about the place that he hated. He pulled himself together and tried to shake off the brooding, premonitory mood that was oppressing him. It was absurd, of course. Old Marble was only a very ordinary sort of chap, seedy and down at heel, but quite all right. He was smiling oilily at present, but that didn't mean anything necessarily. Hang it all, if he didn't like the place he could clear out in a few minutes' time and never come back to it. For the matter of that, Medlin's thoughts swerved suddenly to the utterly absurd. He could change his hotel next morning and then they could never find him again. The bare idea was sufficient to bring his mind back to reality. There was no reason why he should think about things like that at all. The kids were fine, and he'd see a lot of them while he was in England. He could take them to a lot of the places he felt he had to go to, the Tower of London and St. Paul's, for instance. That would be topping. Mr. Marble was speaking to his wife. "What about some supper, Annie?" he was saying. "I expect our young friend here is hungry." "But," began Mrs. Marble hopelessly, and then checked herself hastily and clumsily as she caught sight of her husband frowning at her. "Don't worry about me, please," put in Medlin. "I dined just before I came out." "That's all right then," replied Marble. "I dined just after I came in." And he laughed. The laughter was just the least bit strained. Conversation began again, resuming its hopeless, desultory way while Medlin wondered in a bored, young man's fashion why on earth he did not get up and go at once. There were really several reasons. One was that the wind and the rain were continually making themselves heard outside. Another was that the fire was most attractive. It was the most attractive thing in the whole house. But deep down there was a feeling of relief that he was not in a hotel with nothing special to do. Medlin had laid plans for a very exciting time on his arrival in England, but at the moment he was feeling a little homesick and not in the mood for excitement of any kind. It might have been as well if he had felt otherwise. Mrs. Marble came into the picture at times. She asked him homely questions as to whether he was seasick on the voyage, and whether he had enough to eat, and whether he was warmly enough clad to face an English winter. Medlin answered politely enough, but Marble was positively rude to her on more than one occasion. Medlin found himself regarding the little man curiously. His face was a little moist, and his eyes were brighter than they had been before, as though he was growing excited about something of which the others knew nothing. He cut his wife short repeatedly, and his questions grew more and more personal. Medlin realized that to a person of Marble's character the idea of conversation would consist of a series of questions, but even that was no excuse for this searching cross-examination as to his resources, his friends, and his knowledge of affairs. Poor Marble. And poor Medlin. Marble was being affected more and more by the realization of his position, rendered more acute by envious contrast with Medlin's, while Medlin's every answer seemed calculated to urge Marble on to something. Marble was not quite sure what it was. It could not just be borrowing money. He had decided to attempt that hours ago. The thumping heart within him seemed to indicate something more unusual than that. Marble was nerving himself to definite action, for the first time in his life, be it added. With the cunning of the weak, he did his best to disguise the state he was in, while all the time, without conscious volition on his part, his furtive mind was twisting and turning, devising the course of action he was likely to take. No wonder Medlin looked at him oddly at times. Time seemed to be passing with extraordinary rapidity. It seemed to Marble that every time he looked at the cheap clock on the mantelpiece another half-hour had fled. Twice had he detected in Medlin's manner an intention of leaving as soon as the conversation broke, and each time he had flung himself into the breach, talking nonsense, as he was painfully aware, in order to stave off the crisis that would arise when that time came. His fevered mind roused itself to additional activity. He nerved himself to make the sacrifice which he realized was inevitable, and gathered himself together in his chair as casually as he could manage. "What about a drink?" he asked. In such a matter-of-fact way did he bring the question out that Medland did not guess the wrench it cost him. Medland hesitated before he replied. He was not yet man of the world enough to regard an offer of a drink as an ordinary event, and during that little hesitation Marble had risen and walked across to the sideboard, beyond the table. For a moment he was lost to view as he dived down below the level of the table. When he arose again he had a siphon of soda water, half full, under his arm, 2 tumblers in one hand, and in the other, held very carefully, a decanter of whiskey, a quarter full. He set these things out on the table near his chair. He was standing very close to his wife as he did so. He took the opportunity of mumbling something to her. He spoke swiftly and obscurely, so obscurely that Medland, though he noticed the act, could not hear the words, and took them to be some hint as to domestic arrangements, probably a comment on the shortage of whiskey. What Marble had really said was, "Want talk business. Go to bed. Say headache." Annie Marble heard the words some time before she attached any meaning to them. That was usual with her. Even when she realized their significance, slight enough to her, she did not act at once upon them. It was always a long time before she could coordinate her faculties to change from one course of action to another. Marble poured out a drink with great deliberation. It was not a very generous one, for he was confronted with the problem of offering his guest as much as possible while conserving for himself enough at least to keep up appearances, yet his whole soul was crying out for that whiskey. His hand shook a little as he poured, so that the decanter chattered faintly on the rim of the tumbler, but he took a firm grasp of his nerves with a last despairing effort and completed the business, without having consulted his guest as to quantity even to the usual conventional extent. Then he sat back in his chair, half in anguish, half in satisfaction. He had managed the pouring out perfectly, he told himself. He had given Medland plenty, while quite a respectable amount remained in the decanter. Easily enough for 2 more drinks, anyway, and the half-formed plot in Marble's mind demanded that there should be enough for 2 drinks left in the decanter. But it was a frightful effort for him to sip casually from the cool tumbler in his hand. He wanted that drink so terribly badly, but all he could allow himself to do was to nod perfunctorily across to Medland, sip just a little, and then put the glass down indifferently beside him. But even that small amount was enough to calm his shrieking nerves, so that his shaking body became as calm and detached as his scheming, uncontrolled mind. As he replaced the glass, Annie Marble rose. She knew the role it was necessary for her to assume, and by some strange freak of mental poise she did it perfectly. Her dim mind had never fully realized the grim peril in which lay the fortunes of her husband and herself. Nothing that Marble could say, and he said little, would force it home to her as long as she could go on obtaining credit at the shops. But she knew they were in some trouble, and that Marble was intending that this young nephew of his should help them out. It behoved her therefore to do her best, quite apart from the fact that her negative personality responded in small actions to every whim of her husband, just as he wished. "I think I shall go to bed, Will," she said, rising a little wearily from the uncomfortable bentwood chair. "I've got a bit of a headache." Mr. Marble was greatly concerned. "Really, dear," he said, rising. "That's bad luck. Have a nightcap before you go up?" And he nodded towards the decanter. But even as he nodded, with his face away from Medland, there was a little scowl between his eyebrows that gave Mrs. Marble her cue. "No, dear, thank you," she said. "I'll just go straight up, and it will be better in the morning." "Just as you like," said Mr. Marble. Mrs. Marble moved across to Medland. "Good night, Jim," she said, shaking hands. "Good night. I hope it will really be better tomorrow." "Good night, dear," said Mr. Marble. "I won't disturb you when I come up if I can help it." "I expect I shall be a bit late." He pecked her on her cold cheek, a typical marital kiss. "But Mr. Marble was not in the habit of kissing his wife goodnight at all, and he never worried in the least about disturbing her when he came to bed. However, it gave the scene that calm domestic atmosphere that Mr. Marble's subconscious mind, which had him in full control, had decided was necessary to the occasion. Mrs. Marble had gone, and they heard the dragging steps on the floor of the room above. "No need for hurry, I suppose, seeing that you're a gay young bachelor," said Mr. Marble. "None at all," replied Medland, and regretted saying it the instant it was said. He had really no desire to go on being bored for a further interminable period. But his answer had committed him to another half-hour at the very least, and he endeavored to reconcile himself to it. Just for a brief space, Mr. Marble regained full control over himself, and he made a brief and unavailing struggle against the inevitable which a stronger power within him was forcing upon him. He began to talk again on the subject of Medland's money, the subject on which his lack of decent reticence had already annoyed his guest. "So you're quite a well-off young man now, it seems," he said, with exasperating joviality. "I suppose so," was the curt reply. "A good bit to spare for investments, I suppose?" It was a blundering way of putting it, and it failed. Even on the voyage over, more than one man had come to Medland with get-rich-quick schemes, and he had contrived to see through them. And so many people had borrowed money from him that the process was both familiar and annoying to him. Medland determined to stop this attempt once and for all. It might be awkward for a bit, but it would save endless trouble in the future. He looked straight into Marble's eyes. "No," he said, "I haven't any to invest. I'm quite satisfied with the arrangements that my father made before he died. I've got just enough and no more. And I put up with it." That settled the matter definitely enough for anyone, but, to Medland's surprise, Marble showed no sign of discomfiture. Medland did not know it, but at a bound the lurking power within his uncle had regained possession of him, and had at once begun to smooth the way for the inevitable. "A good thing, too," said Marble, and his manner of saying it left Medland seriously in doubt as to whether his former question had really been a feeler for a loan. "The market's in a rotten state at present. I shouldn't like to buy at all just now, not gilt-edged. Sit tight and hang on to what you've got, that's my motto all the time nowadays." He said it in all sincerity, and Medland actually felt himself warming towards him. At that time Medland was in serious danger of falling into the delusion that so often attacks men of wealth who have had their wealth from boyhood and have been stung too often by the unscrupulous. He was in danger of imagining that everyone with whom he came into contact was seeking profit at his expense. The surest way to his heart was to convince him of the contrary, and that Mr. Marble, in those few instants, had nearly succeeded in doing. The conversation swung easily into discussion of the investment market, and that without the personal note that Medland so much resented. Somewhere within him Marble possessed a clever turn for finance, which hitherto he had been unable, as well as too lazy, to exert. Medland, with a hard head for business inherited from his shipbroking father, recognized a surprisingly kindred spirit. For the first time that evening he really began to enjoy himself. He drained his glass almost without thinking of it. Enthusiasm succeeded in overcoming his juvenile distaste for whiskey, even though he had never been able to make himself like it. Marble was watching him with fierce intentness through narrowed eyes. Medland hardly noticed it, and attached no importance to it if he did. Then Marble pulled himself out of his chair, glass in hand, and addressed himself to the decanter. That foolish heart of his was thumping again, thumping heavily, but it did not affect his actions. They were quite under control, the control of that inward force which had taken charge of him and which recognized the inevitable. Marble reached across and drew Medland's glass from his hand. "There's only one more drink apiece," said Marble. "I'm sorry, but we weren't expecting visitors tonight, you know." He said it in such a matter-of-fact way that Medland had no chance even of trying to refuse the second drink. Idly Medland watched Marble pour out the whiskey from the decanter with the painful care that had characterized his action before. The liquid stood level in the two tumblers. Marble was apparently about to splash in the rest of the soda water from the siphon when he paused as though listening. "Just a minute," he said. "I think one of the kids is calling out." Medland had heard nothing, but he was unused to the noises of the house and made no question. Mr. Marble had heard nothing either. He had said what he did as an excuse to withdraw from the room and go upstairs. It was the most natural action in the world for him to creep out of the room to listen to hear if either of his children was frightened, and it was most natural, too, that he should be carrying in his hand the tumbler that he had held at the moment his attention was distracted. Medland watched him go. Everything was so natural that he did not give a second thought to it. Hardly more than a minute later, Marble came tiptoeing back down the stairs and into the room, the glass still in his hand. "False alarm," he said. "One gets used to these things when one is the father of a family." He turned again to the siphon, and it hissed into the tumblers. Then he passed Medland's across to him. As he took it, the wind outside howled again louder than ever. The windows rattled, and they heard the rain pelting against the glass. "What a night," said Medland. "Drink up," replied Marble, very, very calmly. Chapter 2. When Annie Marble woke in the early morning, she was oppressed with a headache, a real headache this time. She had had a restless night, although, true to his word, astonishingly enough, her husband had not disturbed her when he came up. At this very moment he was sleeping heavily at her side. She turned in the bed and looked at him in the half-light that was straying through the untidy blinds. He lay on his back, his sparse hair standing on end, his eyes closed and his mouth open, his bristling red mustache reinforced now by a coarse but scanty growth of beard. His hands clutched the sheets, and his breath passed in and out of his mouth with a stertorous sound. To most people he would have been an unpleasing picture, but Annie Marble did not think so. She was used to it in any case, and his present helpless attitude and appearance always roused the mother spirit within her, which was almost her sole ordinary characteristic now. She would have liked to have taken him into her arms and hugged him a little, but she would not do so for fear of disturbing him. Instead, she began to wonder whether he had been successful in his management of his interview with the strange nephew last night. She hoped so. She knew he had been worried about money lately. He had told her so on occasion. And he had cut down the money he was accustomed to give her. That didn't matter much, as Mr. Evans and the milkman and the others were all so obliging. But he had been bothered about it, she knew. So she hoped the nephew, she was sure she would never learn to call such a splendid young man plain Jim, had done something for them. He ought to have done, for he had stayed long enough. She had heard them talking long after she had settled herself to sleep. The remembrance brought a new rush of dim recollections to her mind. Will had come upstairs then, just when she was nearly asleep. She remembered wondering what he came for. He had gone into the bathroom. She had heard his keys rattle as he unlocked, she supposed, his photographic cupboard. It was probably to get something he wanted to show Jim. There, she had got it quite natural that time. Jim must be interested in photography too. For a space her muddled thoughts followed no settled line. Then she came back to last night. If Jim was interested in photography, he must have done something for Will. To Annie's mind, everything was done for everybody by somebody else. And she must have been dreaming when she thought she heard that loud cry. She was awake just afterwards, she knew. She must have been dreaming that someone had called out loud, and had awakened still dreaming it. Yes, that must have been it, and she must have gone to sleep again and started dreaming again at once, for she had a hazy, muddled recollection of hearing a strange noise downstairs, as though something was being dragged along the linoleum of the passage downstairs, and one or two sharp taps as though some things were dropping sharply from one step to another on the little dark staircase just outside the kitchen door. What a silly thing to dream. So Jim must have done something for Will. That was a good thing. She hoped Will would tell her all about it when he had the chance, because generally he did not tell her anything, and she was not much good at guessing. It was a little bit of a pity that Will said so little, for he could talk so nicely when he was in the mood. But there, you can't have everything. And Will was such a dear all the time. And just now he looked such a baby, such a nice little baby. She did wish she could take him in her arms just for a moment or two, the way she used to hold John, and Winnie too, when they were little. They weren't such babies now, and tried to get on without their mother, and she felt a little bit lonely sometimes. When Will wasn't worried by things, she could still love him like that, though. It was a pity that he was worried such a lot nowadays. But now that Jim had done something for him, it would be all right perhaps. She would buy some new night dresses, like those in the windows in Rye Lane, very warm and nice, but looking quite nice, too, with nearly real lace on the edges of the sleeves. Then perhaps, but here the alarum on the table at her side went off, and she had to stop thinking. The sudden noise brought her husband to a sitting-up position in an instant. He was still grasping the sheets, and his erect hair made him look so like a frightened baby that Mrs. Marble laughed. He glared and blinked at her uncomprehendingly for a while. "What is it?" he demanded. To Mrs. Marble, mentally constituted as she was, no strange mood came amiss or seemed strange to her. "It's just the clock, dear," she said, 7:30. "The clock," said Mr. Marble. "I thought I was dreaming. Just the clock." He still muttered to himself as he snuggled down into the bed again, with his face hidden by the pillows. Annie had never known him mutter to himself before, but he was still muttering and mumbling to himself as she began to dress. Then suddenly he stopped muttering and sat upright again in the bed. "By God," he said, "I wasn't dreaming." He threw off the bedclothes and climbed stiffly out of the bed. He looked like a pathetic little boy in his striped blue and white pajamas as he hobbled across the room to where his clothes were piled untidily on a chair. He tumbled some of these on the floor as he seized his coat, and he plunged his hand into the breast pocket. Annie could not see what he found there, but apparently it confirmed his suspicions. He stared vacantly across the room for several seconds, the coat dangling from his hands. "No," he repeated, "I wasn't dreaming." He hobbled stiffly but feverishly back across the room and thrust his feet into his carpet slippers and then hurried out of the room. Annie, amazed, heard him enter Winnie's bedroom next door. Then she heard him pull up the blind there while Winnie sleepily inquired what was the matter, unanswered. Annie simply did not understand it. It was the first time she could ever remember his getting out of bed before breakfast was ready. But she could not wait to reflect on the matter. She huddled on the rest of her clothes and hastened downstairs to look after breakfast. There was no end to the surprises of that day. To begin with, Mr. Marble came down in his Sunday clothes of neat blue serge, instead of the dilapidated suit which he usually wore to business, and he only replied to Annie's innocent and inevitable remark on this strange phenomenon with a scowl. He had not come straight down into the dining room, as was his wont, either. Instead, he had gone into the tiny and seldom entered sitting room at the back, and Annie, hastening in duty bound to see what he wanted, found him staring out of the window at the little patch of muddy backyard beyond. It was the same view as he must have seen when he went so surprisingly into Winnie's bedroom. He could see it at any time when he was home, and he must have seen it several hundred, but for all that he was peering through the window at the muddy bed, flowerless as ever, with an intentness that even Annie noticed. It was extraordinary. It was true that by getting up as soon as she had done, he was a quarter of an hour ahead of his usual time, yet even that was no reason for his wasting a good 5 minutes after his breakfast out in the yard wandering aimlessly up and down as though he was looking for something. Yet even Annie could see that he was relieved not to find anything. During breakfast there was nothing unusual. Mr. Marble ate little, but that was his way, and he said less, but no one ever said anything at breakfast at 53 Malcolm Road. John was deep in homework he had to prepare for school, and Winnie sewed a button on her glove in the interval of eating porridge. But after breakfast, while Mrs. Marble was in the passage with her husband helping him on with his coat, he pulled from his pocket, loose, as though he had laid them there ready, a small roll of Treasury notes. "Here," he said, "take these, and for God's sake go and pay Evans off this morning. And we aren't going to deal with him any more. Get what you want from Richards in the future. There's enough there for Evans' bill and a bit over." Annie took the notes thankfully. "Oh, I am so glad, dear," she said. "So Jim did do something for you after all?" Said Mr. Marble suddenly, and she shrank back as she caught sight of the expression on his face. "What do you mean?" he said. "Nothing, dear, except that." "Why, what?" But Mr. Marble had snatched open the door and was striding off. He was muttering again. Truly, Annie had much to think about as she began her daily household duties, and even she felt what a pity it was that she could not think very clearly. There was Will's stiffness, now. He was so stiff that he could hardly walk that morning, and she had never known that since before they were married and he used to play football. But Will couldn't have been playing football last night, could he now? It made her anxious. Then upstairs a new surprise awaited her. Will's other suit, his old everyday one, lay in a tumbled heap on the bedroom floor. She picked it up and put it away. It was sopping wet, and it was thick with mud. That must be why he did not wear it in the morning. How could he have got it so wet and muddy? The idea of football came to her mind again, but of course that was silly. Will did not play football now, and if he did it wouldn't be late at night and in his ordinary clothes. With a sigh, she left the problem alone and went on tidying the room. Then there were Winnie's and John's bedrooms to be done, and after that a look round just to see that everything was in order. In the bathroom, an old memory recurred to her. Will had come in here last night. Perhaps she could see what he came for? But she could see nothing different from usual as she looked round. The locked, glass-fronted cupboard in which Will kept his chemicals hung on the wall beside her. She peered in, as she had done hundreds of times before. The manifold bottles meant nothing to her, but she liked to look at the labels and wonder what they were all about. Some of the bottles were of a mysterious brown, and some were white. They were all very neatly arranged. Except one, and that was a little out of its place on the shelf, as it might be if a man had put it back there in the dark. Annie glanced casually at the label. It conveyed nothing to her at all, but it happened that the queer name stuck in her mind, potassium cyanide. She turned away from the cupboard without further thought. There was a pleasurable little excursion before her. She felt quite thrilled with imagining it as she put on her hat before her bedroom mirror. It was a long time since she had had a lot of money in her pocket as she had now. Not that it would stay there long, as she had to pay off Evan's bill, but it made her feel very rich and great to go into Evan's shop and ask, in quite a matter-of-fact way, for her bill, and then to open her bag and produce a roll of notes and hand over the amount asked as if she were accustomed to such transactions every minute of her life. That would be nice, and then she would go on to Richard's and walk in there, and Mr. Richards would be so nice to her because she was a new customer, and she would order what she wanted, and he would say, "Yes, madam," and "No, madam," as if her every word was law. She was glad that Jim had done something for Will. Otherwise, she would not be having such a happy day. After all, by contrast with the ordinary day of a woman with a house to look after, it would be a happy day. She was still feeling happy when Mr. Marble returned from the office in the evening, just after the children had had their tea and were settling down to their homework. He looked very tired, poor soul, and he still walked stiffly, but Mrs. Marble had a nice tea ready for him thanks to her visit to Mr. Richards' shop. There were nice scrambled eggs, good eggs, not the other kind, and 3 pieces of toast, and there was fresh tea in the pot. Mrs. Marble was disappointed when he looked at the pleasant tea table with evident distaste. He flung himself down in an armchair with a sigh. "Anybody been?" he demanded. "No, dear, no one," replied Annie, surprised. "Sure. Of course I am, dear. Who is there to come?" There was no one besides the milkman and people selling things. It wasn't Mr. Brown's day for the insurance. "That's all right then," said Mr. Marble, and he began to unwrap the parcel he had brought in with him. The children looked up with interest, but they were disappointed. It was only a stupid old bottle of whiskey. But Mr. Marble looked at it very eagerly. "Aren't you going to have your tea, dear?" asked Mrs. Marble. Mr. Marble looked, hesitated, and looked again. "Oh, all right then," he said grudgingly. He sat down before his tray and began to eat while his wife began her delightful duty of looking after him, pouring out his tea, refilling the teapot from the kettle on the fire, and seeing that he was comfortable. But Mr. Marble had hardly begun when he rose from the table and hurried out of the room. Annie, hurt and mystified, heard him in the sitting room next door, for the second time that day, and yet perhaps the second time for months. Almost mechanically she followed him, to find him peering through the window in the half-light out into the backyard, where there was a small rain falling. He started as he heard her behind him. "What are you following me about for like this?" he snapped. "Nothing, dear." "Is there anything you want, dear?" "Nothing, dear." "Anything you want, dear," he jibed. "Only a wife with some sense. That's all." He pushed past her without apology, back to the dining room. She found him there seated at the table, but he had pushed his nice tray away and was staring gloomily at the whiskey bottle, which was perched, like some family god, in the exact center of the table. He could not take his eyes off it. He did not look up as she came in, nor did he speak. For some minutes there was quiet in the room, broken only by the scratching of Winnie's pen and the whispering of the two children to themselves as they toiled over their homework. Annie ought to have taken away the tray and started the washing up. That was her next duty, but for some reason she did not do it. Mr. Marble's gaze shifted from the whiskey bottle and fixed itself on the tablecloth. Clearly he was following some new train of thought. Suddenly he moved uneasily in his chair, and then he looked up. "Has Mrs. What's-her-name been here today?" he asked his wife. "Oh, you know who I mean, the washerwoman person." "No, dear, of course not. She comes on every other Monday. She won't be coming until Monday week." "Well, she's not to come at all. You must do the washing yourself if you can't afford to send it out." "Of course we can't afford to send it out, dear. Laundries are dreadfully expensive now." "Then you must do it yourself." "But I don't want to." "Why must I, Will?" "It's dreadfully hard work." "Hard work never killed anyone yet. I'm not going to have strange women in my house and hanging up clothes in my garden anymore. That's why. But that's enough now. Do what I say and don't argue." And Mr. Marble turned his gloomy gaze once more to the whiskey bottle. Poor Annie was almost crying. It had been such a nice day up to now, and now everything was going wrong. To cover her whimpering sniffs, she took up the tray and went with it down the stairs into the kitchen. Mr. Marble eyed the whiskey bottle. He felt he needed some, despite the fact that he had already had 3 or 4, or was it 5 or 6, whiskeys that day. He was very tired, very, very tired, and his head ached. Just as it ached this time yesterday. No, he didn't want to think about yesterday. How his arms ached with that digging. He ought to have caught cold, too, seeing how it had been raining, but he hadn't. Pure Scotch whiskey. Very plain label on the bottle, but it was good stuff inside. God, but it was. An indescribably passionate longing to drink came over him, and he scraped his chair back from the table and fetched the corkscrew from the sideboard drawer. He drew the cork rapidly and dexterously. Not a scrap fell into the bottle. Then he found himself a tumbler and stood it beside the bottle. There was no soda water left after last night, but he didn't want soda water. He didn't want anything besides the relief that he knew a few sips of that yellow liquid would bring him. He fingered the bottle lovingly, still standing by the table. Suddenly, he became aware of his children's gaze upon him. Glad of the distraction from the drudgery of homework, they had been sitting silently watching his every movement. With a gust of fury, Marble realized that it was impossible for him to drink with those solemn eyes upon him. He put the bottle down again upon the table with a thump. "Confound you, kids," he said furiously. "Why on earth aren't you in bed?" Neither child spoke. The doom was close upon them again, they knew, and this time it was more than could be hoped for another new arrival to postpone it, as had happened so miraculously yesterday. But if they kept quite quiet and pretended to be closely occupied with their work, it might be all right. They buried their noses in their books. Marble could only see the tops of their heads, moving a little as they pored over their writing. "Bah," he said. "Don't act about like that. Shut up those books and go to bed. At once, now." Under more favorable circumstances, they would have protested that it was not nearly bedtime yet. They would have pointed out that it was only a little after 7 o'clock, and they were entitled to another hour at least. But they knew, in the intuitive manner of children, that this time the less they said the better for them. They began silently to pack up their books. "Go to bed. Go to bed," raved Mr. Marble. "Don't look at me like that, sir," thundered Mr. Marble. He had suddenly become half hysterical with rage. He pounded on the table with the whiskey bottle, crazy with thwarted eagerness. John turned his scowling face in another direction, but the expression on his face was unchanged, and served to drive his father more frantic than ever, if that were possible. He reached out and struck the boy a heavy blow with his open hand, making him stagger. They went, without a word, but the scowl on John's face had somehow something triumphant about it now. If he was going to be sent to bed in arbitrary fashion, he would at least see that his father lost his temper during the process. John always felt he disliked his father during these queer moods of his, and the moods were becoming more and more frequent too. The children went, and Mr. Marble sighed with relief. He dragged his armchair up to the fire and put the small table beside it for his glass. He would wait and be quite methodical now that a drink was an immediate certainty. He poured himself out a moderate drink and tossed it off. He felt better at once, more peaceful, more safe. He refilled his glass and set it beside him. Then he sat down comfortably by the fire and gazed at the leaping flames. This was just what he wanted to do yesterday, before that wretched boy turned up and spoilt his evening. But it was even better than yesterday, because then he had only 3 drinks in the decanter. Now he had a whole bottle full, which would last him for this evening at least, without any thought of stinting. It was fine not having to stint. He wouldn't have to stint in any direction at all for another 2 weeks at least, thank goodness, or for a lot more than that, if only he were to change those 5-pound notes. And after all, why shouldn't he? Of course the 1-pound notes were as safe as anything, but the 5ers ought to be just as safe too. They wouldn't give anything away, even if they were traced from Medlin to himself. And if he took care and only cashed them at places where he wasn't known, they wouldn't be traced at all. Anyway, what did it all matter? It was silly to think that he was going to all the trouble he went to last night just to pay off a miserable 30 pounds of debts. Better to be hung for a sheep than for a lamb. Stop. Why was he thinking about hanging? Mrs. Marble, re-entering from the kitchen, saw her husband reach out greedily for the glass on the table at his side and swallow its contents in violent gulps. Then she knew that Dearwell would be unapproachable for the rest of the evening, and she would not be able to have that pleasant chat with him about what Jim had done for them that she had been looking forward to all day. Mrs. Marble was rather disappointed. Chapter 3. Yet for some weeks Mr. Marble hesitated about changing those 5-pound notes. He was of mixed character. When he had been a rat in a corner, he had fought like one, desperately, to the last risk, but now he had escaped, he thought of nothing except flight and covering his tracks. And he was paying heavily enough for those few treasury notes. That heart of his, which had thumped so heavily on that stormy evening, thumped just as heavily at other times now. He could not keep his mind from working out possible occurrences in the future, and some new morbid thought of the arrival of the police, instigated by the officials of Medlin's hotel, or of some unexpected inquiry by the bank as to whence had come the money which had so suddenly come into his possession, would set his heart pounding away until he could only lean back in his chair and gasp. He would wake sweating in the night too, with the fevered blood running hot under his skin, as some fantastic possibility developed in his sleeping mind. Then he would writhe and toss in his bed, muttering faintly to himself, tortured with fears of the known and of the unknown. And sometimes, when he had been sleeping very badly, 1 or 2 horrible memories returned to him, memories of a pair of staring eyes and of a boyish face, the mouth smeared with foam. That was the worst of all. He was not even happy sitting alone in the dining room at Malcolm Road, with a full bottle of his only friend beside him, and calm in the knowledge that no one was poking about in the garden. The whiskey only made him think the more at first. It took a long time before he could stop his mind from thinking about what might happen, and he soon found the worst moments of all were those at the beginning of the evening, when the whiskey only bit and did not deaden. At times the prospect so frightened him that he flinched from his preliminary torture, and would go through the evening without drinking at all, although every fiber of his body seemed to be shrieking for it. These were the times when he craved for the company of his wife and children, when he would encourage Annie to long monologues about how she had spent her day. To Marble, sitting back in his chair, with Annie droning away beside him about her encounter with the baker's boy, who now worked for the butcher instead, and how she went down Rye Lane to buy remnants at the sale, and what Mr. Brown, the insurance agent, had to say, it seemed incredible that anything unusual had happened. It must have all been a wild dream. If it were reality, how then could he be sitting at his fireside so peacefully? Brief monosyllables were sufficient to keep Annie talking, and Mr. Marble had ample time to think of all this. It was too like a fantastic nightmare for anything really to have happened in this very room, this poky, stuffy, suburban dining room, and for a terrible secret to be hidden away in the garden just outside. Drugged by Annie's talk, or by John's or Winnie's chatter about school, Mr. Marble not infrequently succeeded in persuading himself that it was indeed a dream. And Annie was so pleasantly flustered and flattered by his attention in listening to her like this. But when night came, Mr. Marble paid for his relaxation. Then, on the verge of sleep, he would realize that it was not a dream, and he would spend the night turning and tossing in fevered anxiety. Security came back gradually. It was not a feeling of complete security, rather was it a feeling that anything would be welcome if only it would happen. No policeman came prying round 53 Malcolm Road. No official from the hotel came to ask as to the present whereabouts of one James Medland. Marble had paid his debts, every one of them, like a sensible man, and that had taken all the slender store of £1 notes. But his personal expenses were much higher nowadays. They were bound to be while he spent half a sovereign a day on whiskey, and nothing he could say to Annie had any effect in reducing household expenditure. The old rule became well established of spending a little more than his income. Under such circumstances, it was inevitable that the £5 notes should begin to melt away. He was very careful about it, as his bank clerk experience taught him to be. Not one of those rustling pieces of paper ever passed through the hands of one of the local tradesmen, and most certainly never did one go through Mr. Marble's account at the bank. Occasionally at the big, gilded, popular corner houses was to be seen a little round-faced man sitting alone. He ordered an expensive dinner, as expensive as the limited menu allowed, and he would eat it hurriedly and furtively, with never a glance from his pale blue eyes at the people at the other tables, and having eaten he would call for his bill and hurry out. He paid the bill by means of a £5 note, and, thrusting the change into his pocket, he would rush away as though pursued. So he was pursued, too. One pursuer was an impossible fear of one of the frock-coated floorwalkers stopping him and asking him whence came the note, with a meaning glance to an attendant to fetch the waiting detective. And the other was the haunting fear lest there might be someone casually finding out something in a desolate back garden in a dreary street in a southern suburb. Mr. Marble learned what it meant to walk down that street with that foolish heart of his pounding away in his breast, hot with impatience to reach home to ensure that all would be well, and yet standing hesitating at his front gate, unable to go in to face what might be there. Police, or, what would be nearly as bad, a look in the eyes of his wife and his children and words unspoken that meant that they knew. And still nothing happened. The thing that came in the end was not in the least what he expected. It was 9 o'clock in the evening, and Mr. Marble was sitting in the same frosty dining room, from minute to minute gauging with his eye the two most important things of the moment: the height of the whiskey in the bottle and the distance the hands of the clock had moved round. His wife was in the room too, but she made no sign of her presence save for her whispered conversation with herself. A smart rebuff from her husband earlier in the evening had shown her that it was not one of his nice evenings. But when the postman knocked, she rose and went to fetch what he had brought. It was only a single letter, and she gave it to Will. He fumbled it open with whiskey-tangled fingers and read the enclosed typewritten note with whiskey-dazzled eyes. He read it 3 times before he understood the words, and for 5 minutes following he sat quite still as their significance came slowly home to him. It was formal notice to quit the house known as 53 Malcolm Road. It was next morning before he could convince himself that the peril was not as real as his shrinking mind had believed last night. He was safe enough at present, of course. The Rent Act confirmed him in his tenancy for as long as it endured. This formal notice to quit was merely a necessary preliminary to raising his rent. But it gave him real cause for anxiety. It showed him a concrete thing to be afraid of, instead of the wild nightmares of prying neighbors or stray dogs, which might dig in that disused flower bed. Some time or other he might be compelled to leave the house, and what would happen then? He did not know. The next evening the librarian at the local public library had an interview with a little man in a seedy, blue suit, with a ragged, red mustache and weak blue eyes, who went through the formalities to obtain a ticket and then demanded a selection of books on crime. "I am afraid we have very few books on the subject," said the librarian, surprised. "Never mind, let's see what you have got," replied Marble. The librarian brought him an armful of books. There were 2 of Lombroso's works, a volume of medical jurisprudence, 2 or 3 stray works on prison reform and kindred subjects, while from the bottom of the heap the librarian produced apologetically a rather lurid volume on crimes and criminals, historic days at the assizes. Marble took the pile into his trembling hands and peered at them anxiously. "I'll have this one," he said, firmly, crimes and criminals in his hand. The librarian dated it and handed it over unwillingly. For one class of book borrower, he had a friendly feeling. For another, he had toleration, seeing that it was the main support of the library. The one class was that of the humble clerk and mechanic, anxious for self-improvement. The other was that of the diligent reader of fiction. For the omnivorous browser who read all sorts of things, he had a virulent hatred, suspecting him of a prurient desire to lay hold of those books, which even a public library has to a small extent, the gift of some careless donor, or, dangerously, in his opinion, termed classical. And this newcomer was evidently a bad example of this type. His perverted taste was obviously sated even with public library fiction, and the craving for sensation was worse, to his mind, even than the physiological researches of spotty-faced adolescents. He had taken the book of all the library of which the librarian was most ashamed. He shook his head sadly after the receding, bent-shouldered figure. But that was the first night for months that Mr. Marble did not drink more than was good for him. Crimes and criminals held him fascinated. It was not a subject of which he knew very much. He was even ignorant of the details of ordinary criminal procedure. In this book, he found criminals labeled as great. He read ghastly stories of passion and revenge. He read of the final scenes on the scaffold with the dreadful concentration of a bird on a snake. And the hair bristled on his head, and he experienced a horrible sensation of despair as he gradually realized that 2 out of every 3 of the criminals mentioned came to grief through inability to dispose of the body. There was a tale of a woman who had walked for miles through London streets with a body in a perambulator. There was an account of Crippen's life in London with the body of his murdered wife buried in his cellar, but the police laid hold of them all in time. On this damning difficulty, the book dwelt with self-righteous gusto. At midnight, Mr. Marble put the book aside, sick with fear. He was safe at present. Indeed, he was safe altogether on many accounts. As long as he could see that that flower bed was undisturbed, no one would know that there was any cause for suspicion at all. That nephew of his had vanished into the nowhere that harbors so many of those whose disappearance is chronicled so casually in the papers. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, to connect him, the respectable Mr. Marble, with young Medlin's annihilation. But once let some fool start investigations, even involuntary ones, in that flower bed, and the fat would be in the fire. Mr. Marble did not know whether identification would be possible at this late date. He made a mental note that he must get another book from the library in which he could look that up. But even if that were impossible, there would be unpleasant inquiries. And he would be in trouble for certain. Come what may, either he must maintain complete control over that flower bed, or else he must make some other adequate arrangements. And from those arrangements, whatever they might be, his soul shrank in utter dread. They were certain to be his ruin. There would be some unforeseen mishap, just as there had been to the cart in which that man in the book tried to carry his victim's remains along Borough High Street. Then he would be found out, and then? Prison and the gallows, said Mr. Marble to himself, with the sweat pouring in torrents down his face. One thing would give him security, and that would be the purchase of his house. That would give him security against disturbance for the rest of his life. Mr. Marble did not mind what happened after his death, as long as that death was not accelerated by process of law. But how could Mr. Marble possibly purchase his house? He was living beyond his income as it was, he told himself, with a grim recollection of £5 notes changed in popular corner houses. Yet he must. The blind panic of the earlier months had changed to a reasoned panic now. The one object of Mr. Marble's life now was to raise enough money to buy that house. The covering letter to yesterday's notice to quit had hinted that perhaps Mr. Marble would find it to his advantage to buy instead of continuing to rent. Mr. Marble went to bed, to toss and mutter at his wife's side all night long as he framed impossible schemes for acquiring money, a great deal of money, enough to buy the freehold of 53 Malcolm Road. Chapter 4. At the bank, as was only to be expected, they had noticed a slight change in Mr. Marble's manner of late. He always looked worried, and clearly often he had been drinking. The head of the department to whom Mr. Marble acted as second in command noticed it frequently, but he took no drastic action. For one thing, he was glad to have an inefficient second, as that enabled him to keep the work more closely under his own hand, thereby making his retention of his job more probable, and for another, he had a queer sort of liking for poor old Marble. With his worried expression, and his worried eyes, and his worried mustache. In fact, Mr. Henderson was heartily glad that Marble had apparently struggled out of the financial difficulties which had for many months before made him come to Henderson borrowing a fortnight before payday. What Henderson did not realize was that for all Marble's looseness of fiber and seeming incompetence to grapple with anything worthwhile, somewhere in Marble there was a keen mind, razor keen still, despite too much whiskey of late, and a fount of potential fierce energy which might contrive wonderful things if only something were to rouse him sufficiently. Mr. Henderson, of course, knew nothing of a piece of work that Marble had performed marvelously efficiently some months ago. So far, Mr. Marble had found no opportunity of making the money that he hankered after so pathetically. Yet money was in the air all the time that he was working, more so even than is usually the case in a bank department. For the department of the County National Bank, of which Mr. Henderson was executive chief, with Mr. Marble as his chief assistant, dealt solely with foreign exchange, buying and selling money all day, dollars for cotton spinners, francs for costumiers, pesetas for wine merchants, and dollars, francs, pesetas, and, above all, marks, for speculators of every trade or none. Gambling in foreign exchange was becoming a national habit by which the National County Bank profited largely. Here, if anywhere, would Mr. Marble win the money for which he thirsted. But Mr. Marble knew too much about foreign exchange operations, and he was afraid. There had been times when he had made £1 or £2 by well-timed buying and selling, but not many. He had the example before him of those who had bought marks at prices seemingly lower than they could ever be again, only to see them change from the absurd thousands to the still more absurd hundred thousands, which meant the loss of 9/10 of their investment. The wise man who speculated in foreign exchange would do well to sell, not buy, in most cases. And one could not sell without first buying unless one could arrange a forward operation with a bank. One can only profit by a falling market if one sells what one has not got. And no bank would allow anyone to arrange a forward operation unless he could show some sort of reason for wanting to do so. Not much reason, of course, but a good deal more than a mere bank clerk with £60 only in his account could possibly show. There was another advantage about the forward operation, too. It was only necessary in this case to put up a margin of 10% of one's investment. In that case, an increase of 5% in the value of the sum controlled meant an actual profit on the sum invested of 50%, if one were lucky enough to have bought. If one had sold instead, it meant a loss of 50%. If a man were to buy on a 10% margin and the money bought were to double in value, he would multiply the money invested not by 2, but by 20. Mr. Marble thought of the £60 he had to invest, and his mouth watered. But week followed dreary week, and nothing could be done. The foreign exchange market seemed to have gone mad. The mark had fallen away to millions, as the Austrian crown had done 2 years before. The lira seemed to be going the same way. Sterling exchange on New York alone was struggling back to its pre-war position. Even the franc was dropping steadily. Before the war it was little more than 25, now it was over 100, and it was being hammered slowly lower and lower. Mr. Marble watched the market and hesitated. If the franc and the lira were to drop with a crash as the mark had done, and a wise man had sold in advance, he could look for a profit to be reckoned in terms of thousands %. And the brokers with whom Mr. Marble in the course of his daily duties conversed over the telephone all seemed to think it likely. In the foreign exchange department of the National County Bank, head office, all the clerks were convinced of the same thing. Some of them had already made minute sums of money by cautious speculation, helped by their friends the clerks in the brokers' offices. They had sold tiny sums in advance, got out hurriedly immediately afterwards, and then cursed their faint-heartedness as the francs still went on dropping. Mr. Marble saw all this, and was tempted. Twice he nearly ventured, but each time that keen judgment of his, which was always somewhere in the background ready to be called upon, held him back. There was something doubtful somewhere. And then one morning it happened. Chance flung a fortune within Mr. Marble's reach, and only asked from him in return the effort to grasp it. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Marble was at his desk farthest from the entrance to the room, and close beside the partitioned cubbyhole that housed the superior majesty of Henderson, chief of the department. In front of Mr. Marble lay the open letters sent across by the correspondence department, and he was casually glancing through them to see that there was nothing that the department could not cope with without troubling Mr. Henderson. Or even higher authority still. They were all just ordinary routine letters, notifications mainly, from the various continental branches, of credits given and of drafts honored. Nothing of any import. The staff of the department could handle them nearly all. For of them he picked out that he would have to answer. 2 must go in to Henderson. The last letter was the most ordinary of them all. It was the bi-weekly letter from the Paris branch confirming the actions reported already by cable and telephone. Mr. Marble looked through it. Still there was nothing of any interest. For a wonder the Paris staff had made no mistake in decoding cables. Everything had been done as ordered, and no hasty cable would have to be sent countermanding some ridiculous blunder. No forgeries, no failures. Yet Mr. Marble read the letter to the end, because the man who had written it was known to him personally. It was Collins, who had worked under him in that very department for a couple of years before being sent out to Paris. He was a voluble fellow, chatty. Mr. Marble described him to himself, and his volubility was noticeable even in this official correspondence. For at the end of the letter, he had inserted a paragraph that was quite unnecessary by all rules of routine. It was quite brief for Collins, and merely said that more steadiness might be noticed in the French franc in future, as it was rumored that the government were taking the matter in hand, and might even resort to pegging on the London exchange. Mr. Marble laid the letter down and gazed through the dusty window at the uninviting view of other dusty windows across the ventilation shaft. There might be something in it. The franc was a point higher this morning than at the close of yesterday. So much the trained foreign clerk's brain told him. Mr. Marble could at 2 minutes' notice give the rate of exchange on anywhere at any time within the last 2 years. But Mr. Marble was capable, strange though it may seem, of doing more than that if sufficiently stimulated. If the Republic took a hand in restoring its foreign credit, it would do more than merely keep it steady. Mr. Marble suddenly recollected a nebulous idea he had dreamed some time ago as to the best means that would bring this about. He turned this idea over in his mind. If they were to do that, the franc would recover like a skyrocket. It would easily go to 60, it might even reach 50, or perhaps even 40. It would never be better than 40, decided Mr. Marble, weighing the chances with an acuteness of perception that would have astonished him had he only thought about it. Most likely it would be about 60. What's Paris now, Netley? He asked a passing subordinate. 119, 117, replied Netley over his shoulder as he hurried on, hoping that Mr. Marble would notice that he deliberately did not say sir. 2 points rise again, thought Mr. Marble. There might be some truth in the wild theories that had been flashing through his brain. On the other hand, it might be only one of the periodic and temporary recoveries that were usual. The price might sag at any minute again. If Mr. Marble were to buy, he might find that he had bought at the beginning of a fall instead of the beginning of a rise. And if he were to buy on a margin, Mr. Marble had already in his mind a scheme to enable him to do so, then the inevitable 10-point fall would deprive him of 90% of his capital. But then, Mr. Marble's silly heart was already bumping heavily against his ribs. The sort of rise he thought possible would bring him in nearly 100 times the amount invested. Mr. Marble managed to keep his brain deadly clear despite the thumping of his heart, just as he had done that memorable evening some months ago. It was a chance. Mr. Marble's brain sorted out all the tiny indications it had collected and stored up unbidden for weeks past. It was more than a chance. It was a certainty, decided that clear brain. Yet Mr. Marble felt the flush of blood in his cheeks, and his heart beat unbearably as he rose from his seat and walked out of the office on what was to be one of the momentous occasions of his life. Even his gait was a little unsteady, so great was the strain upon him, and the younger clerks whom he had to pass on the way to the door nudged each other merrily as he went by. Old Marble going out for his usual, they said. Bit early even for him. Must have been properly soused last night. There was a public house round the corner, and it was there that Mr. Marble stayed his steps, just as, be it admitted, he had often done before. The girl at the bar knew him, and the double scotch was ready for him before even he was within reach of it. But Mr. Marble did not, as was usual, drain it off and demand another. Instead, he withdrew, glass in hand, to a bench behind a table and sat waiting inexorably, while his heart beat in his fingertips so that his hands shook. It was only just opening time, and there was a steady stream of entrants, stockbrokers and clerks, street betting agents, all the curious mixture that is to be found in a public house 50 yards from Threadneedle Street on a weekday morning. Once or twice men he knew entered and nodded, but Mr. Marble was not cordial. His return nod carried with it no invitation to share his bench and sit at his table with him. Most probably none of them would have accepted such an invitation anyway, unless it were unavoidable. Mr. Marble continued to stare at the swing doors. And then Mr. Marble's heart gave a convulsive throb. He suddenly felt sick with fear of the future. At last his scheme was presented to him in the concrete, instead of the comfortably abstract. For a wild moment he thought of flight, of abandoning the whole business. He could, he knew. He might struggle along for years without the aid that improbable success in this venture would bring him. But Mr. Marble thrust the temptation on one side and proceeded with the business with bitter determination. He beckoned to Saunders, the man whose entrance had caused this last internal commotion. Saunders had his drink in his hand. He had greeted those men at the bar whom he knew, and was glancing round the room to make sure that he had missed no one. He was a plump man of middle height, rosy and prosperous-looking. He knew Marble slightly, that is to say, he had talked to him a dozen times in that public house. He was acquainted with the fact that Marble worked for the National County Bank, which he himself employed, and that was all. Naturally, he was a little puzzled at Marble's beckoning to him, but Saunders took care to be friendly to everyone who spoke to him, seeing that his livelihood depended on the goodwill of the public. Saunders was a bookmaker, in a tiny office 5 stories up near Old Broad Street, conducting his business almost entirely by telephone and by the men who waited about at lunchtime near the corners of the streets. Glass in hand, Saunders came across to the table just as Marble had done before him, and almost without knowing it he sat down opposite him. There was that in Marble's manner which seemed to make it inevitable that he should sit down. "Well," said Saunders cheerily, "how's things?" "Not too bad," said Marble. "Got 10 minutes to spare?" Saunders supposed he had, a little ruefully though, for he had at first imagined that this was merely evidence of a desire to open a credit account with him, and, since Marble's manner did not indicate this, he came to the other conclusion, that he was about to hear a hard-luck story. As far as Saunders' experience went, men between themselves did nothing but bet or borrow. "You do bank with the National County, don't you?" began Marble. "You're right. And you know I work there?" "Right again. What's the matter? Firm going bust?" "My account overdrawn." Saunders was a witty fellow. There never was the slightest chance of the National County suspending payment, and Saunders' account was never lower than £400. But Marble hardly smiled. Instead, he turned his bleak blue eyes full upon Saunders' brown ones. "No," he said, then slowly, "I want to do a deal, and I must have the help of a customer of the bank." "You'll do, or, of course, if you don't want to come in, I'll have to get someone else." "I should think you were right again," said Saunders, but he was not feeling quite so full of levity now. His puzzled mind was searching for Marble's motives. Either this seedy old boy was barmy or else he was on some illegal lay. In either case, Saunders was not having any. Saunders was a law-abiding man, save in the matter of inciting others to street betting. And yet, do you want to hear about it?" said Marble grimly. He had himself as well in hand as when he had offered Medlin that glass of whiskey, but the effort was frightful. His confidence overbore Saunders' easy skepticism. Right-ho. I don't say I'll buy it, though, added Saunders hastily. No. But I want your word that you'll keep quiet if you don't. Saunders agreed. And the word of a bookmaker is accepted all over England. I've got some information. It might mean a lot of money if it were used properly. Racing information. There was a suspicion of a sneer in Saunders' voice. He obtained half his income from people with racing information. No. Foreign exchange. Don't hardly know what that is. No, said Marble. Lots of people don't. Oh, I know a bit, said Saunders, anxious to justify himself. I know about how the mark has fallen to half nothing and all that sort of thing, you know. Somehow the moral tables had turned during those few minutes. Undoubtedly Marble was now in the ascendant. Largely, of course, this change was due to the fact that the conversation was about a subject of which he knew much and the other nothing. But on the other hand, it must be admitted that the vague thing known as personality was affecting the case, too. Marble was putting out all his strength to influence Saunders unobtrusively, and he was succeeding. Men can do much when they have to. Well, said Marble, bleak eyes set like stones, the franc is going to rise, and now is the time to buy. The secret was out now. Saunders could betray him now at leisure. But Marble, never taking his eyes off Saunders, was sure he would not. I don't say you're not right, said Saunders, but what's the little game? Where do I come in? And where do you come in? It's like this, said Marble, showing his whole hand, so sure was he. It isn't much good buying francs outright. I could do that myself next door. But you don't stand to make much that way. This time you might make 100%, but of course that's not good enough. Of course not, said Saunders submissively. The best way to do it is to make a forward operation of it. That means you must put up 10% on a margin, put in Saunders, proud of this little bit of argot picked up during much frequenting of city public houses. Exactly. On a margin. That means that a 5% rise in the franc gives you 50% profit. As I said, it might be 100% rise this time. That would be 1,000% profit, 10 to 1, in other words, added Marble, countering Saunders' effort. Saunders only dimly understood. But I don't see now why you're telling me all this, he said. Why don't you get along and do it? Why tell anyone else at all? Because I'm not allowed to put a forward operation through for myself in the bank. You have to have some legitimate reason for wanting to. And what reason would I have? Saunders was being rapidly drawn into the net. Oh, that's easy. You can easily have some business in France, can't you? Don't you ever bet on French races? Of course I do, sometimes. And don't you ever send money to France? Well, I have done once or twice. Right then. If you were to tell the bank that you wanted to buy francs, they'd believe you all right. And they love you in the bank anyhow. You keep a big current account, and they love anyone who does that. Saunders was still struggling against the mesmeric influence that was beginning to overpower him. Tell me some more about this forward operation stunt, he pleaded, wavering, conscious that in a minute he would have to decide one way or the other, conscious that he would most probably fall in with Marble's plans, and conscious, too, that he did not really want to. Tell me what I should have to do? Marble explained carefully, drilling it into his man with meticulous care. Then he threw his last bait. He showed how, if a man were to take his profit when it amounted to a mere 5 times his stake, and had the hardihood to fling both profits and stake into the business again, by the time the currency purchase stood at twice the figure it stood at the start, the profit would not be 10, but 35 units. Saunders scratched his head wildly. Here, what are you drinking? He asked, signaling agitatedly to the barman, and then leaning forward again to go over the details once more. Marble's cold judgment had chosen his man well. A bookmaker earns his living by other people's gambling, but even with this practical example always before him, there is no one on earth so ready to gamble in anything not pertaining to the turf. Then Saunders made a last despairing effort to writhe out of the business. He said that, after all, he was unacquainted with Marble. How do I know it's straight? He asked pitifully. It can't be very well anything else, can it? Replied Marble, and the condescension in his tone was an added spur to Saunders. I won't be able to pinch your money, will I? It will all be in your account, won't it? If it isn't straight, I can't make anything out of it." Saunders had realized this as soon as the words had left his mouth, and he apologized. Mr. Marble, hope boiling in his veins, was very gracious. "Well, what is it you want out of it?" asked the wretched Saunders. 10% of what you make," said Marble uncompromisingly, "and, of course, I'm going to have a bit on, too." "How much?" 60 quid. Mr. Marble produced a roll of £5 notes, the last of those he had been so careful about changing. He was throwing discretion to the winds now. If ever the notes were traced to him, it would be his own fault, but there was no time for complicated maneuvers to change them. Saunders took them half involuntarily. "In fact," said Mr. Marble, "I should like to have more than that on. Only I haven't got it with me. I could raise it by tomorrow. But tomorrow will be too late." With those baleful eyes upon him, and the reassuring feel of those £5 notes in his hand, Saunders could do nothing except make the inevitable offer. "Thanks," said Marble. "Look here, I tell you what we'll do. Put 400 in. 200 of that will be yours. There's another 60. Then you lend me the odd 140. That makes us just even." Saunders agreed helplessly. "Time's getting on," said Mr. Marble, with a glance at the clock. "We'd better get a move on. I can tell you what to do all over again as we walk back." As though in a dream, Saunders rose from the table and followed him out. The stimulus of the fresh air outside revived him sufficiently to remember to ask Marble how it was he was so certain that the franc was going to rise. "I know all right," said Marble casually. He could afford to be casual, so sure was he of himself, and above all, so sure was he of Saunders. And Saunders weakly yielded to the man with the superior knowledge. He would have hooted with derision at a man who proposed to back a stray acquaintance's favorite horse to the tune of £200. He would have rolled on the ground with mirth if he heard that the same man was going to risk another 140 by backing that horse for his friend. But this was not horse racing, about which he was thoroughly well informed. It was business, big business, and he was awed and submissive. Marble ended his instructions just as they reached the main door of the National County Bank. "Go in there and say you want to buy francs as a forward operation. They'll send you along to my department, so don't worry. I'll be there. I may even do the business for you. But I expect it'll be Henderson that you see. Oh yes, and don't forget, whatever you do, to ring me up 2 or 3 times today and tomorrow. Get through to foreign exchange and then ask for me. It doesn't matter what you say. Just say, what is that you always say when you see anyone in the bar? 'Hello, old bean, how's things?' Keep it up for a bit. Say doodle if you can't think of anything else. That's just to give me authority to move the account about when it's necessary. Got it all? All right then. Goodbye." Mr. Saunders, dazed and mazed, walked weakly into the National County Bank. Mr. Marble walked on to the side entrance, where dwelt his own among other departments. The sweat was running off him in streams. For a brief space he had been a master of men. He had swayed a hard-headed man into doing something totally unexpected. He had gambled with fate, and he had won. For a while he had known the wild exultation of success. He had done something that he would certainly not have done without the urgent impulse due to a slight indiscretion one stormy night some months ago, but reaction closed upon him with terrible swiftness. His steps dragged as he came into the Department of Foreign Exchange. He felt, and he looked, inexpressibly weary. The junior clerks nudged each other again as he walked by. Old Marble's had as much as he can carry already. He'll be getting the sack one of these days, just see if he doesn't. And Marble, tired to death, weary with fear, worn out by the thumping of his heart, crept brokenly to his desk and buried his face in his hands.